Boy asks a millionaire, "Are you the man in my mum's photo?" What they discovered was able to change the course of their lives. Welcome to the channel. Enjoy the video. Give it a like. Subscribe, turn on notifications, comment and share. The gentle patter of rain against the windows of the rainy day cafe created a soothing backdrop to the early morning bustle. Sophie Anderson, a petite woman with honey blonde hair tied back in a neat ponytail, moved gracefully between tables, refilling coffee cups and exchanging warm smiles with the regulars. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet determination, her green eyes reflecting both weariness and hope. "Order up, Sophie," called Maggie Johnson, the 60-year-old owner of the cafe, her voice carrying over the clinking of plates and murmur of conversations. Sophie hurried to the counter, balancing 2 plates of steaming pancakes. As she turned to deliver the breakfast to a nearby table, the bell above the door chimed. A tall, distinguished-looking man in a tailored suit stepped inside, shaking raindrops from his umbrella. His presence seemed to change the atmosphere in the cafe instantly. Ethan Parker, 35, stood in the doorway, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room before settling on an empty booth in the corner. As he made his way to the seat, several patrons turned to look, whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day that one of Seattle's most eligible bachelors and successful entrepreneurs graced a small neighborhood cafe with his presence. Sophie approached his table, notepad in hand. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to the Rainy Day Cafe. Can I get you started with some coffee?" Ethan looked up, and for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition passed across his face. He quickly composed himself and nodded. "Yes, please, and I'll have the breakfast special." As Sophie turned to fetch the coffee pot, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen this man before. There was something hauntingly familiar about his eyes, the curve of his jaw. She pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the possibility that she had seen his picture in the local business news. Little did Sophie know that this seemingly ordinary morning would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel secrets long buried and change the course of multiple lives forever. Across town, in a cozy apartment filled with the laughter of cartoons, 6-year-old Liam Anderson sat cross-legged on the floor, his attention divided between the colorful characters on the TV screen and the box of old photographs he had discovered while looking for his favorite toy car. "Mommy, who's this?" Liam called out, holding up a slightly faded picture. Sophie's babysitter, a kind college student named Emily, peered over his shoulder. "I'm not sure, sweetie. We should ask your mum when she gets home from work. Now come on, it's time to get ready for school." Liam reluctantly put the photo back in the box, but not before studying it intently. The image of his mother, younger and carefree, standing arm in arm with a handsome man on a beautiful beach, burned itself into his memory. He had never seen his mother look so happy, and he had certainly never seen the man who had his arm around her waist, looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Back at the Rainy Day Cafe, the morning rush was in full swing. Sophie moved efficiently between tables, her mind occasionally drifting to the mysterious man in the corner booth. Ethan, for his part, found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the hard-working waitress. There was something about her that tugged at the edges of his memory, like a dream he couldn't quite recall upon waking. As Sophie approached to refill his coffee, Ethan cleared his throat. "Excuse me. I hope this doesn't sound strange, but have we met before? You seem familiar." Sophie paused, coffee pot hovering over his cup. "I was actually wondering the same thing. Your face seems familiar, but I can't place where I might have seen you." Before either could pursue the conversation further, the cafe door burst open, and a striking woman in her early 30s strode in, her heels clicking authoritatively on the tiled floor. "Ethan, there you are," she exclaimed, making her way to his table. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. We have an urgent situation with the Horizon project." Ethan's expression hardened as he stood to greet her. "Victoria, I told you I needed some time to think. This wasn't an invitation to track me down." Victoria Reeves, Ethan's business partner and longtime friend, cast a dismissive glance at Sophie before turning back to Ethan. "This can't wait. The board is meeting in an hour, and we need to present a united front." Sophie, feeling suddenly uncomfortable, excused herself and retreated to the safety of the counter. She couldn't help but overhear snippets of their heated conversation as she pretended to wipe down the already spotless surface. "Can't just walk away from this, Ethan. Too much at stake. Tired of the games, Victoria. There has to be more to life than just think about your father's legacy." The Parker name The mention of Parker caused Sophie to freeze. Parker? Why did that name send a shiver down her spine? She racked her brain, trying to connect the dots that seemed to be just out of reach. As the day wore on, Sophie found herself increasingly distracted. The handsome stranger, the name Parker, the nagging feeling that she was on the brink of remembering something important. It all swirled in her mind, like the cream in the lattes she served. When her shift finally ended, Sophie hurried home, eager to see Liam and shake off the strange feelings that had plagued her all day. As she entered their small apartment, she was greeted by the sight of her son sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by old photographs. "Mommy!" Liam exclaimed, jumping up to hug her. "Look what I found! Who's this man with you?" Sophie's heart nearly stopped as Liam thrust the photo into her hands. There, frozen in time, was a moment she had tried so hard to forget. A perfect day on a Hawaiian beach, her younger self radiant with happiness, and next to her, "Oh my God," Sophie whispered, her knees suddenly weak. Ethan. The memories came flooding back. A whirlwind romance during a vacation in Hawaii 6 years ago. The passion, the promises, and then nothing. She had returned home to Seattle heartbroken and alone, only to discover weeks later that their brief encounter had left her with an unexpected gift. Liam. "Mummy, are you okay?" Liam's concerned voice broke through her reverie. Sophie forced a smile, kneeling down to her son's level. "I'm fine, sweetheart. This is just an old friend of Mommy's from a long time ago." As she tucked Liam into bed that night, Sophie's mind raced. Ethan Parker, the man she had never been able to forget, the father of her child, had walked back into her life as suddenly as he had vanished from it. What did it mean? And more importantly, what was she going to do about it? Little did Sophie know that across town, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking the Seattle skyline, Ethan Parker was having a similar moment of realization. The waitress from the cafe, the nagging feeling of familiarity. It all made sense now. As he stared at an old photo album, his eyes fixed on a picture from a Hawaiian vacation 6 years ago, a mix of emotions washed over him. Shock, regret, and a glimmer of hope. The stage was set for a reunion that would unearth long-buried secrets, challenge perceptions, and potentially heal old wounds. Old. But as the rain continued to fall softly over Seattle, neither Sophie nor Ethan could have predicted the storm of revelations and emotions that awaited them. Revelations that would not only change their lives, but also impact those around them in ways they could never have imagined. As the first light of dawn began to break through the cloudy Seattle sky, both Sophie and Ethan lay awake in their respective homes, their minds churning with questions, memories, and the weighty possibility of what the future might hold. Little did they know that the biggest surprises and the true test of their character were yet to come. The next morning dawned grey and misty, a typical Seattle day that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Sophie's heart. As she tied on her apron at the rainy day cafe, her hands trembled slightly. Would Ethan return today? And if he did, what would she say to him? "You all right, honey?" Maggie's concerned voice broke through Sophie's thoughts. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sophie managed a weak smile. "I'm fine, Maggie, just didn't sleep well last night." Maggie patted her arm sympathetically. "Well, buck up. That handsome fella from yesterday called to reserve the corner booth again. Looks like we might have ourselves a new regular." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. He was coming back. She busied herself with the morning preparations, trying to calm her nerves. As the bell chimed, announcing the first customers of the day, she took a deep breath and plastered on her best professional smile. The morning rush came and went, but there was no sign of Ethan. Sophie found herself glancing at the door every few minutes, a mixture of relief and disappointment washing over her each time it opened to reveal someone else. It wasn't until the lunch crowd had thinned that the bell chimed once more, and Ethan Parker walked in. This time, he wasn't alone. A small figure clutched his hand, peering around curiously at the cafe. Sophie's world tilted on its axis as she recognized her son, Liam, standing next to the man she now knew to be his father. How was this possible? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the scene before her. Ethan's eyes locked with hers across the room, a storm of emotions playing across his face. Uncertainty, hope, and a touch of fear. He guided Liam to the corner booth, never breaking eye contact with Sophie. Taking a deep breath, Sophie approached their table. "Good afternoon," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What can I get for you today?" Liam looked up at her, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mommy, look who I met at the park. He's the man from your picture." Sophie felt the color drain from her face as Ethan cleared his throat awkwardly. I think we need to talk, Sophie," he said softly. She nodded, unable to find her voice. "Maggie," she called over her shoulder, "I'm taking my break now." As Sophie slid into the booth across from Ethan and Liam, the air between them crackled with tension and unspoken words. Liam, oblivious to the adult's discomfort, chattered happily about his morning at the park. "I was playing on the swings," Liam explained, "and I saw him sitting on a bench. He looked just like the man in your picture, Mommy, so I went to ask him." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of nervousness that Sophie remembered all too well from their time in Hawaii. "I was surprised, to say the least," he said, his voice low. "When Liam showed me the picture and told me his mother's name, I knew I had to bring him here." Sophie's mind whirled with questions. How much did Ethan know? What did this mean for their future? But before she could voice any of these thoughts, the cafe door burst open once again. Victoria Reeves strode in, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "Ethan, what do you think you're doing? The board is in an uproar, and you're here playing house." All eyes in the cafe turned to the unfolding drama. Ethan stood, positioning himself between Victoria and the booth where Sophie and Liam sat. "Victoria, this isn't the time or place," he said, his voice tight with warning. But Victoria was undeterred. Her gaze swept over Sophie and Liam, a calculating look in her eyes. "So this is why you've been distracted lately? A secret family?" "Oh, Ethan, how cliché." Sophie felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She stood up, placing a protective hand on Liam's shoulder. "I think you should leave," she said to Victoria, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Victoria's eyebrows shot up, a cruel smile playing at her lips. My, the waitress has some spark. Tell me, dear, how much is it going to take to make you and your little situation go away quietly?" "That's enough," Ethan's voice boomed through the cafe. The few remaining patrons watched in stunned silence as he grabbed Victoria's arm and steered her towards the door. "We're leaving. Now." As they reached the exit, Ethan turned back to Sophie, his eyes pleading. "I'm sorry. I'll be back later to explain everything. Please wait for me." The door closed behind them, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. Sophie sank back into the booth, her legs suddenly weak. Liam looked up at her, confusion written across his young face. "Mommy, why was that lady so angry? Is she mad at me?" Sophie hugged her son close, her mind reeling. "No, sweetheart, she's not mad at you. Grown-ups just... sometimes they have complicated problems." Maggie appeared at their table, concern etched on her weathered features. "Sophie, honey, why don't you take the rest of the day off? You look like you could use some time to sort things out." Grateful for her boss's understanding, Sophie nodded. She gathered Liam and their things, her thoughts a jumbled mess as they made their way home. As evening fell, Sophie sat on their small balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. Liam was inside, happily absorbed in a cartoon, blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding him. Sophie's phone sat heavy in her hand, Ethan's hastily scribbled number burning a hole in her pocket. Should she call him? Part of her wanted answers, explanations for his disappearance 6 years ago, for his sudden reappearance now. Another part of her wanted to gather Liam and run, to protect the life they'd built from the chaos Ethan's return threatened to bring. A soft knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Her heart pounding, Sophie moved to answer it, somehow knowing who she would find on the other side. Ethan stood in the hallway, looking decidedly less put together than he had earlier. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. Sophie hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. As Ethan entered the small apartment, his eyes took in the colorful drawings on the fridge, the toy cars scattered on the living room floor. His gaze lingered on a framed photo of Sophie and Liam, both laughing as they built a sandcastle on a local beach. "He looks just like you," Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie crossed her arms, suddenly feeling defensive. "Why are you here, Ethan? After 6 years of silence, why now?" Ethan turned to face her, his eyes filled with regret and something else, hope, perhaps. "I never knew. Sophie, I swear if I had known about Liam, I would have been here in a heartbeat." "You left without a word," Sophie countered, fighting to keep her voice low so as not to disturb Liam. "No note, no call, nothing. How was I supposed to tell you?" Ethan sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. "I know. I was a coward. My father, He found out about our relationship. He threatened to cut me off, to destroy your reputation if I didn't end things immediately. I thought I was protecting you by leaving. Sophie felt her anger deflate slightly, replaced by a weary sadness. And now, what changed? Everything, Ethan said, looking up at her. My father passed away last year. I'd been re-evaluating my life, my choices. And then, by some miracle, I walk into that cafe and find you again. Find out I have a son. Sophie, I want to make things right. As Sophie struggled to process Ethan's words, a small voice piped up from the hallway. Mommy, who's that man? Both adults turned to see Liam standing there, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Ethan's face softened as he looked at his son. Hey, buddy. Remember me from the park today? Liam nodded, then looked at Sophie questioningly. She knelt down to his level, her heart racing. Liam, sweetie, this is your dad. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Liam's eyes widened as he looked between Sophie and Ethan. My dad? Like Tommy's dad who comes to school sometimes? Ethan moved slowly, kneeling beside Sophie. That's right, Liam, and if it's okay with you and your mom, I'd like to start coming to your school sometimes too. I'd like to get to know you. As Liam processed this information, his face broke into a wide grin. Cool. Can you come to my t-ball game on Saturday? The tension in the room dissipated slightly as both Sophie and Ethan chuckled at Liam's enthusiasm. We'll see, sweetie, Sophie said, ruffling his hair. Now it's past your bedtime. Say goodnight to your dad, and I'll be in to tuck you in a minute. As Liam hugged Ethan goodnight and scampered back to his room, Sophie and Ethan were left facing each other, the weight of their shared past and uncertain future hanging between them. We have a lot to figure out, Sophie said quietly. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. I know I have a lot to make up for, but Sophie, if you'll let me, I want to be a part of Liam's life, and yours, if you'll have me. Before Sophie could respond, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Ethan's face paled as he checked his phone. It's Victoria, he said grimly. She must have followed me here. As Sophie moved to answer the door, she couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a storm that would test them all. Whatever happened next, she knew that her quiet life had been irrevocably changed. For better or worse, Ethan Parker was back in her world. And nothing would ever be the same again. Sophie's hand hesitated on the doorknob, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced back at Ethan, who nodded grimly, bracing himself for the confrontation to come. Taking a deep breath, Sophie opened the door. Victoria Reeves stood in the hallway, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against her designer handbag. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene before her. Sophie in her simple home clothes, Ethan looking decidedly rumpled, and the modest apartment behind them. Well, isn't this cozy? Victoria said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan, darling, I hope you realize what you're risking with this little family reunion. Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sophie. Victoria, I told you this isn't the time or place. We can discuss business matters tomorrow. Victoria's lips curled into a cold smile. Oh, but this is about business, Ethan. Everything is about business. Or have you forgotten about the Horizon project? The millions of dollars at stake, the legacy your father entrusted to you? Sophie felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of Ethan's father. She remembered all too well the pain in Ethan's eyes when he spoke of his father's ultimatum 6 years ago. I haven't forgotten anything, Ethan said, his voice low and firm. But some things are more important than money or legacies. I have a son, Victoria. A family. Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. A family? Please. This woman and her child are nothing but gold diggers, Ethan. Can't you see that? She's probably been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to sink her claws into you and your fortune. Sophie felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. How dare you? She hissed, stepping out from behind Ethan. You don't know anything about me or my son. We've managed just fine without Ethan's money for 6 years, and we'll continue to do so if necessary. Ethan looked at Sophie with a mixture of surprise and admiration. He turned back to Victoria, his expression hardening. I think you should leave now, Victoria, and I strongly suggest you refrain from making any more accusations against Sophie or Liam. Victoria's composure slipped for a moment, revealing a flicker of desperation in her eyes. You're making a mistake, Ethan. A huge mistake. Don't throw away everything we've worked for. As Victoria turned to leave, she paused, fixing Sophie with a cold stare. This isn't over. Enjoy your little fairy tale while it lasts." The door closed behind her with a resounding click, leaving Sophie and Ethan standing in stunned silence. The quiet was broken by a small voice from the hallway. "Mommy, is the angry lady gone?" Sophie turned to see Liam peeking out from his bedroom, his eyes wide with concern. She quickly went to him, kneeling down to wrap him in a comforting hug. "Yes, sweetie, she's gone. Everything's okay, let's get you back to bed." As Sophie tucked Liam in, Ethan hovered in the doorway, watching the tender interaction between mother and son. His heart ached for all the moments he had missed, all the bedtime stories and goodnight kisses he hadn't been there for. When Sophie emerged from Liam's room, quietly closing the door behind her, she found Ethan sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. She sat down beside him, leaving a careful distance between them. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," Ethan said, his voice muffled. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Victoria, the company, my father's expectations, it's all such a mess." Sophie felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her, sympathy for Ethan's obvious distress, lingering anger over their past, and a growing curiosity about what exactly was going on with his business affairs. "Ethan," she said softly, "I think it's time you told me everything. What's this Horizon project that Victoria mentioned, and why does she seem so desperate to keep you involved?" Ethan sighed deeply, finally looking up to meet Sophie's gaze. "It's complicated, but you deserve to know the truth. The Horizon project was my father's brainchild, a massive real estate development that would transform a huge swath of coastline into luxury resorts and condos. It's worth billions, but—" He trailed off, a troubled look crossing his face. Sophie waited patiently, sensing there was more to the story. "But," Ethan continued, "I've recently discovered some disturbing information about the project. Environmental reports that were buried, local communities that would be displaced. And my father and Victoria, they knew about all of this, but they pushed forward anyway." Sophie's eyes widened as she began to understand the gravity of the situation. "So that's why Victoria is so adamant about you staying involved. She's afraid you'll expose everything." Ethan nodded grimly. "Exactly. And now that I've found you and Liam, I have even more reason to want to distance myself from the whole thing. But it's not that simple. My father's will, there are conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Sophie asked, a sense of foreboding settling over her. "If I want to retain control of the company and my inheritance, I have to see the Horizon project through to completion. Otherwise, everything goes to Victoria." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. "I've been trying to find a way out, to do the right thing without losing everything, but it's like being caught in a web." Sophie sat back, her mind reeling from all this new information. The Ethan she had known in Hawaii, carefree, kind, full of dreams, seemed a far cry from the conflicted man before her now. And yet, she could still see glimpses of that person in the way he looked at Liam, in his determination to make things right. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "I don't know yet, but I do know that I want to be a part of Liam's life, and yours, if you'll let me. I've missed out on so much already, I don't want to miss any more." As they sat there, the weight of their shared past and uncertain future hanging between them, a soft knock at the door startled them both. Sophie glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Who could be visiting at this hour? With a sense of déjà vu, Sophie moved to answer the door. Ethan closed behind her. As she opened it, they were confronted with a sight that made them both gasp. Standing in the hallway was an elderly man, his silver hair neatly combed, leaning heavily on a cane. His piercing blue eyes, so similar to Ethan's, moved between Sophie and Ethan, a mix of emotions playing across his weathered face. "Dad?" Ethan breathed, his voice a mix of shock and disbelief. "But how? We thought—" The old man's lips curved into a sad smile. "Hello, son. It seems we have a lot to talk about." Sophie stood frozen, her mind struggling to process this new development. Ethan had said his father had passed away, yet here he was, very much alive and standing at her door in the middle of the night. As Robert Parker stepped into the small apartment, the air seemed to crackle with tension and unspoken questions. Sophie's gaze darted between Ethan and his father, noting the similarities in their features and the stark contrast in their expressions. Ethan's a mask of confusion and growing anger, Robert's a mixture of regret and determination. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," Robert said, his voice gravelly with age but still commanding. "And why I'm not—" well, dead. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. That would be a good start, he said, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. Do you have any idea what you've put me through? What you've put all of us through? Robert's eyes moved to Sophie, then to the closed door of Liam's room. I see I have a grandson, he said softly. Ethan, my boy, I know you must have 1,000 questions, but please let me explain. Everything I've done, the deception, the Horizon Project, all of it, it was to protect you, to protect our family. Sophie, feeling like an intruder in this family drama but unable to leave, sank onto the couch. Ethan remained standing, his body tense as if ready for a fight. Protect us? Ethan scoffed. By faking your own death? By forcing me to choose between my happiness and my inheritance? Some protection, Dad. Robert sighed heavily, lowering himself into an armchair. It's a long story, son. One that starts long before you were born, with choices I made that have haunted me ever since. But now, with what I've discovered about the Horizon Project, I knew I had to come out of hiding. We're all in danger. You, me, your new family. And only by working together can we hope to make things right. As the clock ticked past midnight, Sophie found herself witness to the unraveling of a complex web of family secrets, corporate intrigue, and long-buried emotions. With each revelation, she realized that her quiet life with Liam had been irrevocably changed. The future she had carefully planned was now as uncertain as the loyalties of those around her. Yet, as she watched Ethan struggle with the shock of his father's return and the weight of the secrets being revealed, Sophie felt a strange sense of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. Little did they know that across town, Victoria Reeves was making a phone call that would set in motion events that would test their newfound unity to its very limits. The real storm, it seemed, was only just beginning. The soft light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the curtains of Sophie's small apartment when the group finally fell into an uneasy silence. Robert Parker, looking every bit his age after hours of explanation and heated discussion, sat slumped in the armchair. Ethan paced the room like a caged lion, his mind still reeling from the night's revelations. Sophie, exhausted but alert, kept glancing towards Liam's room, grateful that her son had somehow slept through the emotional storm that had raged in their living room. So let me get this straight, Ethan said, his voice hoarse from hours of arguing. You faked your death to investigate corruption within our own company, and now you're telling us that the Horizon Project is just the tip of the iceberg? Robert nodded wearily. I know it sounds incredible, son, but when I started noticing discrepancies in the company's finances, I realized the only way to get to the bottom of it was to remove myself from the equation, make the real culprits think they were free to act without my scrutiny. Sophie, who had been quiet for most of the night, finally spoke up. But why come forward now? Why risk exposing yourself? Robert's eyes, so like Ethan's, fixed on Sophie with a mixture of gratitude and regret. Because of you, my dear, and because of my grandson. When I learned about Liam's existence, I knew I couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. The stakes had become too high. Ethan stopped his pacing, turning to face his father. You knew about Liam for how long? A few months, Robert admitted. I've been keeping tabs on you, Ethan. When I saw you start visiting that cafe, saw you interacting with Sophie and eventually Liam, I knew it was time to act. The corruption within Parker Industries goes deep, son, and I fear that Victoria is at the heart of it. At the mention of Victoria's name, Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered the woman's parting words, the thinly veiled threat in her voice. She was here earlier, Sophie said. She seemed desperate to keep Ethan involved in the Horizon Project. Robert's face darkened. I'm not surprised. Victoria has always been ambitious, but I never thought she'd go this far. The Horizon Project isn't just about luxury resorts and condos. It's a front for something much more sinister. Before Robert could elaborate, a soft knock at the door made them all freeze. Sophie's heart raced as she moved to answer it, half expecting to see Victoria's cold smile on the other side. Instead, she found herself face to face with Maggie Johnson, the kindly owner of the Rainy Day Cafe. Maggie? Sophie gasped. What are you doing here? Maggie's usually cheerful face was etched with worry. I'm sorry to barge in like this, Sophie, but something's happened. The cafe, it's been ransacked, and I think it has something to do with you and your handsome friend here. Sophie ushered Maggie inside, her mind whirling. As Maggie took in the scene, Ethan looking disheveled, Robert Parker very much alive, and the general air of tension, her eyes widened. "Oh my," Maggie breathed. "I see I'm not the only one having an unusual morning." Quickly, Sophie made introductions and explained the situation as best she could. Maggie listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "I always knew there was more to your story, Sophie dear," Maggie said, patting her hand. "But I never imagined anything like this. Now, about the cafe. When I arrived to open up this morning, I found the place in shambles. Tables overturned, the cash register pried open. But here's the strange thing. Nothing of real value was taken. Instead, I found this." Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. On it, in bold red letters, was a simple message: "Stay away from the Parkers." The room fell silent as the implications of the message sank in. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice tight with anger. "This has gone too far. We need to go to the police." Robert shook his head vehemently. "We can't trust the local authorities. Not yet. We don't know how far Victoria's influence reaches." "Then what do you suggest we do?" Sophie asked, fear and frustration evident in her voice. "I have Liam to think about. I can't put him in danger." As if on cue, a small voice piped up from the hallway. "Mommy, what's going on? Why is everyone here?" All eyes turned to see Liam standing in his pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The sight of his innocent face, confused and a little scared, seemed to galvanize the adults into action. Ethan knelt down to Liam's level, his voice gentle. "Hey, buddy, how about you and I go get some breakfast while the grown-ups talk? I make a mean stack of pancakes." Liam's face lit up at the prospect of pancakes with his newfound dad, momentarily forgetting the strange gathering in his living room. As Ethan led Liam to the kitchen, Sophie turned back to Robert and Maggie, her resolve strengthening. "All right," she said, her voice low but determined. "What's our next move?" Robert leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a mix of determination and something that looked almost like excitement. "We need to gather evidence, proof of Victoria's involvement in the corruption and of the true nature of the Horizon project. I have some leads, but I'll need help to follow them." Maggie, who had been quietly taking everything in, suddenly spoke up. "You know, in my years of running the cafe, I've heard all sorts of interesting tidbits from my customers, including some rather intriguing gossip about certain business dealings along the waterfront. I might be able to help with your investigation." Sophie looked at Maggie with newfound appreciation. The kindly cafe owner had always seemed to know more than she let on, but Sophie had never imagined she might be sitting on valuable information. "That would be incredibly helpful, Maggie," Robert said, a hint of his old charm shining through. "But I must warn you, getting involved in this could be dangerous." Maggie straightened her back, a fierce look coming into her eyes. "I may be old, Mr. Parker, but I'm not helpless. Sophie and that boy of hers are like family to me. If they're in danger, wild horses couldn't keep me from helping." As the group began to form a plan, Sophie's mind drifted to Ethan and Liam in the kitchen. She could hear their laughter, the clatter of pans, and the sizzle of batter hitting the griddle. It was a moment of normalcy in the midst of chaos, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Over the next few days, an unlikely team began to take shape. Robert, using his presumed dead status to move undetected, started digging into the company's old files. Ethan, playing the role of the dutiful son to keep Victoria's suspicions at bay, gathered what information he could from within Parker Industries. Maggie, armed with her extensive network of cafe regulars, began quietly collecting rumors and whispers about the Horizon project, and Sophie, determined to protect her son and the life they had built, found herself at the center of it all. She continued her shifts at the cafe, now a hub of covert meetings and information exchanges, all while trying to maintain a sense of normalcy for Liam. As pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The Horizon project, it seemed, was more than just a luxury real estate development. Hidden within its plans were designs for a massive data center, one that could potentially be used for widespread surveillance and data mining. "But why?" Sophie asked one evening, as they all gathered in her apartment after Liam had gone to bed. "What's the end game here?" Robert's face was grim as he answered, "Control, my dear. Information is power in today's world. Whoever controls the data controls the future, and Victoria, it seems, has ambitions that go far beyond mere corporate success." As the gravity of the situation sank in, Sophie felt a mix of fear and determination. They were up against something much bigger than they had initially thought, with stakes that went beyond just their own lives. Ethan, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "We need to move faster. Victoria's getting suspicious. Today she hinted at knowing something about Liam. I think she's planning to use him as leverage." The room fell silent at this revelation. Sophie's heart raced as she contemplated the threat to her son. She turned to Robert, her eyes blazing with a fierce protectiveness. "What do we do now?" Robert stood, his face set with determination. "We end this. Tomorrow, we make our move. It's time to confront Victoria and expose everything we've learned." As the group began to finalize their plans, none of them noticed the small red light blinking on Sophie's phone, indicating that their entire conversation had been recorded. Across town, in a luxurious penthouse office, Victoria Reeves smiled coldly as she listened to the audio feed. Her finger hovered over a button labeled "Initiate Protocol Omega" as she whispered to herself, "Oh, Robert, you should have stayed dead." The stage was set for a final confrontation, one that would determine not just the fate of the Parker family, but potentially the privacy and freedom of countless unsuspecting citizens. As dawn broke over Seattle, Sophie, Ethan, and their unlikely allies prepared to face their greatest challenge yet, unaware that Victoria was already several steps ahead in a game they didn't even know they were playing. The Seattle skyline was bathed in the soft glow of dawn as Sophie, Ethan, Robert, and Maggie made their way towards the imposing Parker Industries headquarters. The streets were quiet, the city still waking up, unaware of the drama about to unfold within the glass and steel tower looming before them. Sophie's heart raced as she thought of Liam, safely tucked away with a trusted neighbor. She had kissed his sleeping forehead before leaving, whispering a promise to make everything right. Now, as they approached the building that held so many secrets, she prayed she could keep that promise. "Remember the plan," Robert said in a low voice as they entered the lobby. "Ethan, you'll go up first as usual. Sophie and I will follow shortly after, using the service elevator. Maggie, you're our eyes and ears down here. Anything suspicious, you call us immediately." Maggie nodded, settling herself in the lobby with a newspaper, the picture of innocence. As Ethan strode towards the executive elevator, Sophie couldn't help but admire his composure. He looked every inch the successful businessman, not betraying a hint of the turmoil within. 15 minutes later, Sophie found herself in a plush office on the top floor, her heart pounding as she stood beside Robert, facing Victoria Reeves across a massive mahogany desk. Ethan stood to the side, his face a mask of determination. Victoria's smile was cold as she regarded them. "Well, well, the prodigal father returns, and he's brought reinforcements. How touching." Robert stepped forward, his voice steady. "The game is over. Victoria, we know everything about the Horizon Project, the hidden data center, your plans for mass surveillance. It ends now." For a moment, Victoria's composure slipped, surprise flickering across her face, but she quickly recovered, her laugh sharp and mirthless. "Oh, Robert, you always did underestimate me. Did you really think I wouldn't be prepared for this?" With a flick of her wrist, Victoria pressed a button on her desk. Suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of their own voices, the secret conversations they'd had in Sophie's apartment, planning this very confrontation. Sophie gasped, realizing with horror that they'd been compromised from the start. Ethan moved to stand protectively in front of her, his fists clenched at his sides. Victoria's smile widened. "You see, I've known about your little investigation for quite some time. In fact, I've been counting on it. You've played your parts beautifully. All of you. Especially you, Sophie dear. You and that precious little boy of yours." At the mention of Liam, Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. "What have you done?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Oh, nothing yet," Victoria said, her tone almost bored. "But let's just say that Liam's safety depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes. Now, Robert, be a dear and hand over the evidence you've gathered. All of it." The room fell silent as the gravity of the situation sank in. They were outmaneuvered, outsmarted at every turn. Sophie's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a solution that wouldn't put Liam in danger. It was then that Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're bluffing, Victoria. You wouldn't dare harm a child. It goes against everything the company stands for, everything my father built." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Are you willing to bet your son's life on that, Ethan? Because I assure you, I'm willing to go to any lengths to see this project through." As tension filled the room, a commotion could be heard from the hallway. Suddenly, the office door burst open, and to everyone's shock, Maggie Johnson strode in, followed by a team of stern-looking individuals in suits. "I believe that's quite enough, Ms. Reeves," Maggie said, her usual warmth replaced by steely determination. "FBI, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corporate espionage, and attempted kidnapping, among other charges." For a moment, the room was frozen in disbelief. Victoria's face drained of color as she realized her carefully laid plans were crumbling around her. This is impossible," she sputtered. Maggie's eyes twinkled as she turned to the stunned faces of Sophie, Ethan, and Robert. "Did I forget to mention? I'm not just a cafe owner. I've been working undercover for years, investigating corporate corruption in Seattle. Your case, Mr. Parker, caught our attention quite some time ago." As the FBI agents moved to apprehend Victoria, Sophie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She turned to Ethan, who pulled her into a tight embrace. Over his shoulder, she saw Robert sink into a chair, the weight of years of deception and worry finally lifting from his shoulders. In the chaos that followed, statements given, evidence collected, Victoria led away in handcuffs. Sophie's thoughts remained fixed on one thing: Liam. As soon as they were cleared to leave, she and Ethan raced to the neighbor's house, bursting through the door to find Liam happily playing, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded. Sophie scooped him up in her arms, tears of relief streaming down her face. Ethan wrapped his arms around both of them, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. They were together, they were safe, and against all odds, they had a future to look forward to. In the days that followed, the full scope of Victoria's plans came to light. The Horizon project was dismantled, its hidden components exposed to public scrutiny. Parker Industries underwent a massive restructuring, with Ethan at the helm, committed to steering the company back to its ethical roots. Robert, no longer needing to hide, threw himself into making amends with Ethan, with the company, and with the grandson he was only now getting to know. His expertise proved invaluable in untangling the web of corruption Victoria had woven through the corporate world. And Sophie? She found herself at a crossroads. The rainy day cafe, so long her anchor in a turbulent world, now seemed like a chapter of her life that was closing. But as one door closed, another opened. With her insider's perspective on the scandal and her natural talent for connecting with people, she was offered a position heading up Parker Industries' new community outreach program. It wasn't an easy decision, but as she stood in the cafe one last time, looking at the place where her life had changed so dramatically, Sophie knew it was the right one. Maggie, now retired from both the cafe and the FBI, had decided to sell the business, but not before extracting a promise from Sophie that she'd visit often. "Life has a funny way of surprising us," Maggie said, giving Sophie a warm hug. Who would have thought that a simple cup of coffee could lead to all this? 6 months later, Sophie stood in the kitchen of a beautiful house overlooking Puget Sound. Through the window, she could see Ethan and Liam playing catch in the backyard. Their laughter carried on the breeze. Robert sat on the patio, watching his son and grandson with a contentment that seemed to have erased years from his face. As Sophie began to prepare dinner, her hand brushed against the small velvet box hidden in her pocket. Ethan had given it to her that morning, with a nervous smile and a promise of forever. She hadn't opened it yet, wanting to savor the moment, to appreciate how far they'd come. The sound of the doorbell pulled her from her reverie. Opening the front door, she found Maggie standing there, a twinkle in her eye and a freshly baked pie in her hands. "I thought we could use something sweet to celebrate," Maggie said with a wink. As Sophie ushered her in, she felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. This unlikely family, forged through hardship, strengthened by love, and bonded by shared secrets, was more than she could have ever dreamed of. Later that evening, as they all sat around the dinner table, Sophie looked at the faces of those she held dear. Liam, chattering excitedly about his day at school. Ethan, his eyes filled with love as he gazed at her. Robert, finally at peace with his past. And Maggie, the unexpected guardian angel who had brought them all together. Sophie stood, raising her glass. "To family," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "To second chances, unexpected blessings, and the power of a simple cup of coffee to change lives." As their glasses clinked together, Sophie knew that while their journey had been far from easy, it had led them exactly where they were meant to be. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility, and she couldn't wait to see what surprises it held. Outside, the Seattle skyline glittered against the night sky, a reminder of the world they had changed and the lives they had touched. And in that moment, surrounded by love and laughter, Sophie realized that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the smallest gestures, like a stranger walking into a cafe on a rainy Seattle morning. As the evening wore on and stories were shared, Sophie slipped away to the patio, the velvet box finally open in her hands. The ring sparkled in the moonlight, a promise of a future she once thought impossible. She felt Ethan's arms wrap around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What do you say, Sophie?" he whispered. "Ready for our next big adventure?" Sophie turned in his arms, her heart full to bursting. "With you, always," she replied, sealing her answer with a kiss. Inside, Liam's laughter mingled with the warm conversation between Robert and Maggie. Out here under the stars, Sophie and Ethan held each other close, the city lights twinkling below like a sea of possibilities. Their story, like so many great tales, had begun with a chance encounter, but it was their courage, their love, and their unwavering belief in each other that had written its extraordinary conclusion. As they stood there on the threshold of a new chapter, Sophie knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. And so, dear listener, our tale comes to an end. But for Sophie, Ethan, Liam, and all those whose lives they touched, it was just the beginning of a lifetime of love, laughter, and yes, even a few more surprises along the way. After all, in Seattle, you never know what might happen over your next cup of coffee.